So good morning. My name is Clint Brown. I work with the Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, and we're going to be going through a safety connection related to rigging and hoisting. More so looking at the stone, steel, concrete, precast industry as part of an MLIT initiative, or MLITSD initiative. But we'll talk about that in a couple seconds here. So just to introduce myself, I am a warehouse and distribution specialist out of Huntsville, Ontario. I've been with the WSPS, or Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, for the last 8 years, and I've been working in health and safety since May 8th of 1999. It's been going on a while now, so I am going to be going through the presentation, but with me today, kind of there to answer the tricky questions should they come along, is our special guest, Mr. Shelley, from the MLITSD. Kevin, if you want to give a brief introduction.
Sure. So I'm Kevin Shelley. I'm the regional program coordinator for the MLITSD out of the Central West region, out of the Newmarket office. I'm basically the liaison between, yourselves out in the field, my inspectors, the management team here to, as Clint said, answer any of the sort of technical-y stuff.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Okay. So let's move along here. So just a couple of things. As we go through the presentation, it is copyrighted, so we just ask that you refrain from copying it in any way, screenshotting anything. If you can avoid that, that would be great. And we have a demographic survey here, just really the purpose being to find out who's attending these courses, what kind of workplaces you work in, and so on. It is not mandatory. It is definitely voluntary. And if you want to take part in this, it is appreciated. It also helps us kind of figure out what areas that we can focus on with workplaces and so on that might be attending. So there is a QR code there on the screen. If you have one of those lovely cell phones, you could probably focus over top of that and open it up should you want to. Again, it's not mandatory. As you go in, there may be a request there, I believe, for a function number, and that is on the screen there. So maybe if you want to jot that down, if you want to take part in that, I'll give you a couple of seconds to scan that should you like to. Do have to apologize. I'm a little nasally still. I've been dealing with a sinus infection, so it's hanging in there. Okay, so as we get into this, computer audio is definitely recommended. If you've got headphones like mine, it might help make it a little clearer. Hopefully you can hear me fine this morning. Your microphones are going to be muted, but I will say that I have a second screen open with the chat open, so there is a chat that you'll have access to. I also have my coworker Connie Costa watching the chat just in case I miss it, so that she can potentially answer anything that she can in the chat or prompt me to have a look at it. So thank you, Connie, for doing that. We'll try and catch everything, and if we don't get an opportunity to answer those things that may be in the chat as we're going through, we'll definitely take some time at the end of our presentation to take any questions that you may have. All right, so your cameras are going to be off throughout the presentation, just so you know. Yeah, so there are some ways for you to engage should you choose to, and I've seen a couple people already at the thumbs up. That's definitely okay and appreciate it. That way I know I'm just not talking to my monitor, so definitely nice to see those thumbs up from time to time. That's at the top of your screen. If you're not familiar with Microsoft Teams, you'll see something that looks like a smiley face with the word React under it. If you click on that or hover over it, let's see on my end here. I think if you click on it, gives you the opportunity to select from a couple of things there, should you like to, like we just saw with the heart coming up there. Yes, thank you. There are no polls today, so you really don't have to worry about that. I'm not going to ask you any challenging questions. And like I said, there is a meeting chat, so please feel free to put anything in the chat that you'd like. I guess I should say that the session is being recorded. So at the end, again, if you're uncomfortable with putting anything in the chat that might be recorded, we can turn that off at the end of our session, and we will open up the chat to any questions that you may have and have the recording off. Okay. Should you require live captions, at the top of your screen, you're going to see 3 little dots with the word more. If you were to go up and click on that, you'll be able to see the word language or language and speech, pardon me, and then turn live captions on, and you'll be able to follow along with that should you need to. Also at the top of your screen, there is an option for you to go full screen under View. If you click on View, more options, and then full screen. The only thing I might say about that is that if you don't have a second screen, anything that might show up in the chat will likely be lost, I think. I don't know if they've changed that at all, but I know in the past when I've done this, if I've gone full screen, I lose that ability to look at the chat. So just something to think about. Okay, so our goal is to really learn and discuss around specifically rigging and hoisting today. It's giving us an opportunity to connect with our peers in a like industry. We'll be talking about some best practices that ideally you will have in place at your workplaces. And then this obviously gives you the opportunity to do this from your personal space. So let's look at the next slide and really kind of talk about, and Jim, I'm going to give you the opportunity to let people in if they keep showing up so I can focus more on the screen here. So why are we here? Unfortunately in Ontario, we continue to see serious incidents, unfortunately some fatalities related to hoisting, rigging, moving materials. And generally when we're doing this, these objects are large enough that, well, we need a hoist to be able to do it. And if for some reason something were to occur, the outcomes, as I've already said, tend to be critical in nature or unfortunately fatal in nature. So we're really here to talk about an initiative that is going to be occurring within the province of Ontario, specifically currently within the Central West region of Ontario. However, this could definitely expand in the future depending on how things turn out, I'm sure. So what we're going to be looking at specifically, or what the MLITSD, not myself, will be focusing in on is more your rigging and hoisting practices within your workplace, looking at the competency of workers. And what we want to do is really get you prepared for that within your workplace. So that's really the purpose behind this session today, is look at some of the things that ideally you're going to have in place at your workplaces. Hopefully you have in place already, and this won't be new information to you. But if not, we want you to maybe just take a second look at what's happening in your workplace and make sure that everything in your workplace is happening in a safe manner, and we're ensuring that our staff are getting home at the end of the day without any incidents occurring. So when will this be happening? You can see on the screen there, the inspection window currently is February 16th to March 31st of this year. And definitely, like we said, there is opportunity for that to change. So what we want to go through with you this morning as part of this safety connection is talking about how we could potentially reduce hazards in our workplace around rigging and hoisting. We're going to look at some of the rigging and hoisting components that you may or may not have in your workplace. We're going to look at some of the best practices around these devices. Again, the nature of this industry, there are so many different types of rigging devices available out there that we obviously don't have time to talk about all of them. I'm going to touch on some of the more common ones that we might see in this industry and talk about some of the safe work practices, safe work procedures that hopefully you've got in place around those devices. And then we're going to look at what ideally you would have in place to be prepared should the ministry come knocking on the door and want to have a look at your workplace and the nature of the work that you're doing. Okay. So again, please feel free as we go through this to put any questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer those questions as we go along, or again, we'll give you time at the end of the session. So within Module 1, we're going to talk about rigging and hoisting in general. Where I like to start is really, what are we talking about? What is rigging and hoisting, and what does a worker have to deal with when they're doing this type of task? To some, it might seem pretty basic, pretty straightforward, but as a person working as a trainer in this industry for 18 years, I can tell you it's not as basic as you might think. There's a lot going on with somebody who has to rig up a load and move it. First, being able to identify really what are we lifting and moving, and then determining from there what kind of rigging we might need to be able to correctly attach that to the hoist, the crane, whatever it happens to be that we're using to move it, in some cases possibly forklifts. And then at that point, they would have to determine what is the capacity of the item that we're lifting, how much rigging do we need to be able to lift that device, are we dealing with sling angles and things along those lines, and be able to determine whether or not we've got the right type of rigging equipment, and that the stresses applied to that rigging equipment are going to allow us to do that work in a safe manner. Then they have to determine if the rigging equipment is actually in good condition from when it was used last, because very often it's laying on top of some equipment somewhere, or it was left where the last person used it, what was it exposed to, and so on. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully in your workplace you've got a nice prepped area for your rigging to hang, and that somebody's frequently doing an inventory of that rigging equipment. Then what they have to do is determine really where are they going to rig this to the hoist. Again, with different industries, obviously there's other things that we have to pay attention to, like the condition of the material and so on. And then what they're going to have to do is determine where they're going to take it. So what is the path of travel? What's within that path of travel? How many people are in that path of travel? Where might I unexpectedly encounter someone and be able to prepare themselves for that? Maybe speaking to people that might be in workstations along that path of travel and letting them know that they're going to be moving material through that area, and that it would be best that they move from their workstation during the time that they're actually moving that material. And then really looking at the location in which they're going to be placing the material once they have transported it there, and making sure that that area is prepped and ready for the deposit of that load. And this is all happening before they've even really started the job. This is the thought process that somebody doing this job is going through, or hopefully going through, as a part of their general rigging and hoisting practices. And then once they've got the load up and it's now moving, they have the concerns of those people that potentially are entering into that path of travel, and being able to control that load as they move it. Unlike a forklift that you might be using in your workplace, or some other type of heavy equipment that's on wheels, generally they have a brake pedal, and that piece of equipment is pretty good at stopping when you depress that brake pedal. Most crane operators don't have that luxury. When a load is moving, there's drift that's occurring with that. There's that kind of dynamic force, we'll call it, that's being applied to that load. And just because they stop pressing that button doesn't mean that that load's going to stop immediately. So this is something that they have to deal with as they're moving the load throughout the workplace. So what is rigging and hoisting? That's really just the basic part of it without actually getting into doing the job. So what do we need to do from a senior leadership perspective? If you're part of your senior leadership and you're joining us today, there's some things that you should ideally be doing before your staff start to do this type of work. And one of those things would be to start with a thorough risk assessment of that particular type of work that's going on in your workplace. Looking at Again, what are we going to lift? What is our material weigh in general? What kind of crane do we have within our workplace? What are the limitations of that crane? Then we look at our rigging equipment. Do we have the right rigging equipment for that job? Or are our staff trying to do things with what we've provided them in kind of makeshift rigging loads to a crane or a hoist or a forklift for that matter? Maybe do we have in-house manufactured rigging components, which definitely is something that we need to be paying attention to. My favorite place to look when I was doing training like this, and hopefully you can look in these places as well in your workplace, are the toolboxes of those that might be doing rigging and hoisting. I always found interesting things in those toolboxes where they've done some in-house manufacturing of rigging devices because maybe the appropriate equipment for them to perform this task hasn't been provided to them. And some workers just get inventive. I've seen everything from washers welded to bolts to in-house manufactured S-hooks and all kinds of different things. So ratchet straps used where slings should be used. So all part of what we want to be looking at as we're doing this risk assessment to determine where are the hazards in this work that workers could be exposed to. Then really looking at, and probably the best way to do this is to kind of go down on your shop floor or the area in where rigging and hoisting is occurring and watch what your staff are doing. And look at the likelihood of something occurring while a load is being moved. What's the potential for a load to fall? What's the potential for rigging equipment to fail? And then really starting to think about what would the consequences of this be? And then really starting to look at what controls can we put in place within our workplace that will, in a perfect world, eliminate that hazard altogether. Unfortunately, when it comes to rigging and hoisting, that's extremely challenging to eliminate the hazard altogether. So what can we put in place to reduce the potential for an incident to occur? When we think about risk assessments, we look at probability of an incident and severity of an incident. Unfortunately, when we talk about rigging and hoisting, the severity side is usually in the high side, and there's not a lot we can do to decrease those consequences because we're lifting and moving extremely heavy things. Where we have the control is really looking at the probability. What controls can we put in place around providing the right rigging devices, providing the right crane, opening up the space where those operators might be moving loads. Again, putting extremely well thought out safe work practices in place. And this might involve speaking to your staff, your crane operators, getting them involved in this process so that we can develop those safe work practices right from the time that we go to lift the load to the time that we put it down. And a big part of this one also would be thinking about things like communication within our workplace. How are your staff communicating with each other? Is it a loud, noisy environment? Is this going to create a hazard? Are signals being used? Is everybody trained in those hand signals? Are we using two-way communication devices? All part of what we want to be looking at in that risk assessment to make sure that we've got the proper steps in place to allow these operators to lift the material and move it from point A to point B in a safe manner where they're exposing anybody to the potential of this load falling and endangering them. And then really for us, focusing in on how we can reduce the overall hazard exposed to that, which again, I've talked a little bit about. So how do we do this? We're really focusing in on our safe work procedures, safe operating procedures. Our organizations may have different terminologies for this, but really what we're talking about is putting something pen to paper, if you will, writing something down that directs our staff on how to perform the task of rigging a load and moving it from point A to point B with a crane or a hoist in a safe manner, or a forklift. Again, from time to time we see that happening. So what we want to do is maintain a full inventory of all of the rigging devices that we have. determine what our staff might be using, how they might be using it. One of the excellent places for you to go to look towards good, safe work practices would be to go to the manufacturer recommendations for each individual device. I've yet to see a manufactured rigging device, hoisting device that someone has sold that hasn't come with some kind of manufacturer's recommendation on how to use it safely. Obviously, again, from a liability perspective, whoever manufactured it doesn't want to be held accountable for somebody using their device unsafe. So usually there's fairly rudimentary safe work practices. What we want to do is take those and then make them site specific, specific to our workplaces, specific to the way that our staff might be using them. This is a good time for us to also find out if there are any in-house manufactured devices that our staff might be using. And not to say these devices can't be used as long as you take the proper steps. Very often I've come across workplaces where the right rigging equipment doesn't exist, so they've had to work with an engineer who's going to think about things like safety factors in design of the lifting device, that are going to think about things like capacities, working load limits for those that may not be familiar with rigging equipment. Not too often do we see something on a rigging device that says capacity specifically. Generally, you're going to see something that says SWL or WLL, generally in the form of a safe working limit or a safe working load, or a working load limit is what we're going to see on our rigging devices. So again, really focusing in on that, making sure that we have the right devices for our staff to be able to do the work that they need to do with that hoist. And this can also be the hoist itself, which we'll talk about here, where we need to make sure that it can do the work we need also. So once you have this, we want to develop then a hoisting and rigging program that is going to include the work that we need our staff to do. So again, things around how we want the device to be used within our workplace, the different types of loads that our staff might be lifting and moving, and the steps necessary to do that, again, right from beginning to end, that we can document and then provide to our staff in some form of training, which is really important. Once we put a safe work practice in place, it's only as good as the communication of that safe work practice. And to do this, very often our staff are going to go through some kind of safe rigging and hoisting training, if you will. So what I generally refer to as the CSA standard, B167. In that standard, it talks about providing your staff with theoretical training around the safe operation of the crane. But to be fair, crane operation is fairly straightforward, not to make slight of it, but it's up, down, north, south, east, west generally. Really difficult is for them to manage, again, that dynamic movement of a crane where, again, it doesn't have brakes and so on. But our theory needs to focus in on also all of those rigging practices specific to our workplace. That is really, really important. How are we rigging up our materials? How are we lifting our materials? What devices are we using? What do the manufacturers say about the use of those devices? And making sure that all of that is communicated to the end user, the worker on the floor that is going to be using it. And then an important element over my years of working in this industry that I find is missing is the practical training aspect of it. It's really important for us to have the individuals move what they're going to be moving on a daily basis as a part of their job in that training, where they're being supervised by a competent individual who can walk them through the steps of how to rig up that load in a safe manner, be able to identify hazards that might exist when they're rigging up that load, and then practicing moving it. So things like pre-planning that need to be performed, like, okay, I'm going to lift that load up from here, I'm going to move it to the other end of the building, and I'm going to place it on the back of potentially a truck. So what does that look like? Do I have the deposit area prepped prior to me lifting that load, even beginning to rig that load? Do I have my path of travel planned? What hazards can we communicate to those individuals that might exist along the route of travel? Things like again, where other people might intersect with the movement of this load, pedestrian pathways and so on, workstations where individuals might be located, and making sure that they understand the communication practices that we expect of our rigging or hoisting operators, rigging individuals, so that they can communicate to all staff when they're doing these jobs. And that again might be hand signals. It might be again that two-way radio type communication, but communication is extremely important. And then also being able to understand that there's the potential that these loads may move in an uncontrolled manner if they're long pipe that we might be moving, or lengthy objects where, again, based on the nature of the load itself, for us to rig that load, we might not be able to get to the outside edges of that load. We might be more locating in the center of gravity of that load, trying to pick it up, and there's the potential for uncontrolled rotation of that load. Well, now we might need someone like a tagline individual to be included. So what does that look like? And are we training those individuals as well to be able to control that rotation as we move that load? And again, making sure that communication is a big part of that. So when we speak about training, this is the type of training we want to see happening in your workplaces. Site-specific, nature-specific to the job that the individual is going to be performing. Using those rigging devices, being able to identify when that rigging device is in poor condition. And we'll talk about some of those things that they might look at shortly here. Hoists. So I hear this term hoist all the time when I'm out in industry. So I want to be specific. This thing right here, that's the hoist drum on this device. This thing right here, this is a chain fall hoist. This is a multi-part hook block that is attached to a hoist up here. A hoist is a component within a crane. This is a dual girder bridge crane. This is, again, a hoist that we might see, a turret type hoist that we might have within our workplaces. Good question. What qualifies someone to competently deliver rigging and hoisting training? So I generally refer people back when this question comes to me to that B167 standard. It does speak a little bit to that nature, but definitely it would be somebody, if we want to look at the basic definition of competent within the Occupational Health and Safety Act, somebody has training, knowledge, and experience, awareness of the hazards associated to the work that would be performed within your workplace, and has knowledge of the act and the regulations, really. So I look more to someone who has experience doing the task of rigging, hoisting, ideally someone who has rigging and hoisting experience to the nature of the work that you'll be doing, lifting the loads that you'll be lifting, being able to identify the hazards that might exist in that particular application within, ideally, your workplace. Somebody who has knowledge of the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations that apply to the work, knowledge of how to properly inspect a hoist, be able to identify things like dynamic force that might be applied to rigging equipment during the movement, and being able to explain that in a manner that it is understood by those that would be being trained. Probably doesn't simplify it for you, Connie, but that's really what we need to make sure we're looking at in our workplace. And not everybody in our workplace can do this. So we might have to look at third-party training providers. And even at that, I would be very thorough in looking into who that training provider might be, so that we have, again, qualified, competent people doing that training for us. Okay. So again, to the point here, these are different types of cranes. Every crane has a hoist generally. That's what's going to allow us to pick that load up. So very important for us when we look at our hoist or our crane. Some things to point out here. a pre-operational inspection. Hopefully your organization has some kind of pre-operational inspection checklist that would be in place. Again, this should be a component of the training that our staff would be going through, ideally theoretically and practically, but definitely practically, so they can identify things like whether or not the crane assembly is in good condition, that the hoist drum is in good condition, that if it's wire rope, the wire rope is in good condition, that the hook block, the sheaves are in good condition, that the wire rope is wrapping around the hoist drum in the correct manner. If it's chain fall, that we've got the right kind of chain, that there's a bag for that chain to fall into ideally so that it's not entangled in anything. That they know how to check the upper limit switch, the lower limit switch, to test the brakes. All of these things would be components of a pre-operational inspection that we would want our staff to know and understand. Be able to identify things like capacity. And when dealing with cranes, it's not uncommon, and I've come across this many, many times throughout my career, where I might find on a bridge up in this area here, it's going to have usually a capacity marked in tons, but there are two different tons, so it's really important for us to pay close attention to that. There's a metric ton, which is generally in the form of a small t or a lowercase t, and there is a short ton or an imperial ton that is in the form of an uppercase T, or they might be spelled differently, T-O-N-N-E or T-O-N. And it's really important for us to pay attention to this because it's not uncommon for the hook block to have one type of capacity marked on it and the bridge to have another capacity marked on it. Seen this many times, many times in industry. What's important for us to communicate to our staff is that they know what the lowest rated component is and that they're not exceeding the capacity of that lowest rated component. So this would be an important thing for us to make sure that we have as part of our safe work practice as well, and that it's documented. And also things like annual inspections that might be done. So something called an LDI, Regulation 851, speaks very clearly that you have to have an annual inspection done on your lifting device, and it's very frequently called an LDI, usually done by a third party, where they're going to come in and they're going to do a lifting device inspection to determine that that device is still capable of doing the work that it was intended to do, that the brakes on the device are going to be capable of stopping the movement of the material that might be attached to it, and so on. Looking at things like the hook block, the sheaves, the different components within that device to make sure that they're capable of doing the work that needs to be done. And then things like safety latches and other devices and stops and so on that might be a part of that assembly. So again, these are all things that we want to make sure are within our procedures, that are, again, clearly communicated to our staff. So again, as I said, as we move into these rigging devices, there are so many rigging devices out there in this type of industry that I didn't have time to really speak to all of them. But what I'm hoping you'll take away from this is really the need for things like inspection procedures and safe work procedures specific to the lifting device itself. I'm going to talk about some of the common ones that we might see in this particular type of industry, and what you can ideally look for when it comes to safe work practices. So with this is a clamp, very commonly used in the stone industry, possibly in some concrete industries. However, concrete's pretty abrasive and might not be good for a clamp like this. But when we look at these clamps, they are friction based devices where we would very often be paying attention to the condition of these pads as an example here. So we're going to be doing a pre-use inspection of these devices. And it's really important for me to stress that pre-use is not the beginning of your shift. It's not the beginning of your day. When it comes to a lifting device, it's extremely important for us to inspect it prior to each individual lift, prior to us using it. Because during our last lift, something could have occurred to that device. And without us and again, once you get used to using the device, you're going to be able to do this fairly quickly. But it's really important for us to look at things like the device for cracked welds, for condition of these pads, as an example. These devices can easily be damaged during a prior lift or over a number of lifts. To an example, one of the things I noticed very commonly in this industry using these devices is these pads right here. They do become abraded, they wear down, but also they tend to fill full of the material that we're working with, to the point where I've seen some of these grooves that we have within this pad here at times so solidly packed within them that the concrete dust or the stone dust or whatever it happens to be that you're using this device on gets packed in there, and it's almost as hard as the material that we're lifting. And what this does is it reduces its ability to grip that material and potentially allows for the load to slip or slide out of the jaws of that clamp, which could lead to, during, again, dynamic movement. And again, when I talk dynamic movement, I'm talking about that swinging or swaying of that load, where if you've ever, here's a quick way to kind of think of it. If you've ever taken a bucket of water and you've kind of walked along with it and had it swing or sway at all, if you've ever had when it extended out before it started to sway back again, it felt like there was more weight there. That's dynamic force, right? So this happens when we're moving a crane, and it's really important for us to think about that when we're using devices like this, and the potential for that load to, again, slip, slightly move, potentially make its way out of that device where it could drop and endanger someone, especially when we start to look at those companies that might be doing things like using a device that maybe was in-house manufactured or doesn't have a verified capacity on it, and our staff don't know what the working load limit of the device is. One of the common practices that I saw with this is companies potentially lifting more than one thing within the device also. So really important for us to be very clear with our safe work practices around what the manufacturer says again. So refer back to the manufacturer recommendations on how they tell us how that device should be used, and follow those directions. Some of the safe work procedures that I might look to see are in place, especially as a trainer going in to train someone on this device, is have we talked about how this device should be positioned on the material. Very important for us as an operator is to take the time to find out where the center of gravity of a slab might be, so that we can make sure that this is positioned in the center of gravity, so that again, thinking about dynamic force, if we've got too much weight on one side or the other, that slab is not going to hang level. And if it's hanging lower on one side than it is on the other, then it's, again, pulling to that direction and potentially going to allow that material to slide out of it. And also paying attention to the slab itself. There might be things like fault lines or things like that, especially as a co-worker within that company, somebody more experienced, they might be able to point those things out that a newer operator might need to pay attention to, so that the slab itself doesn't fail as we lift it and move it through the workplace. I've talked about the load limitations and making sure that we're lifting one thing at a time. Some of these devices may also have locking pins, so we want to make sure that those locking mechanisms are functioning correctly. We want to test them, make sure that, again, it's doing what we need it to do to secure itself to that load. And this might be, again, a very important thing for you to look at in your workplace, especially when you're doing your risk assessments. Are your staff doing things like trial lifts? Very commonly, we would do like a lift the load initially off the ground to test this device, maybe an inch, so it's not very far for it to drop, but enough that the hoist has taken that load up. It's hanging off of the below the hook lifting device, and we're doing a 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. It allows us to check a couple of things. One is the device working the way we need it to? What does the balance look like on that load? Is the hoist brake functioning the way it's supposed to? All really good things for us to do within that first 3 seconds. It's not a big amount of time to make sure that everything's working the way we need it to. And then we want to make sure that we're orienting that slab correctly, like I talked about. And one of the things to avoid with these devices, especially at this time of the year, frozen slabs. There's, again, the potential that frost buildup, snow, things like this could affect the ability for that device to grip against that material. Also, if it's very wet or slimy, these devices don't do a good job with that. So it might be teaching our staff things like proper maintenance of the device, cleaning it, and so on, to maintain the ability for it to do its work. Again, something that we would talk about as part of our safe work practice is the need to move these materials slowly in a calm, kind of steady manner, if you will, where we're, again, able to control that motion of that load as it moves and sways, so that if we needed to stop it, we have that ability to do so. And very important is to talk to our staff about fall shadow or danger zones, hazard zones, whatever your organization might call them, around where to stand when moving these loads. One of the common hazards that I saw in industry around hoist and rigging operation was the individual operating the hoist wanted to stand in front of the load and tended to want to walk backwards in front of that load. Two big issues with that. One, we're in the path of travel. Two, we might be in that fall zone where if something were to occur, we could have that slab or whatever it is land on top of us. A couple other things that could be an issue also is now we're not looking in the direction of travel, so the potential for a slip, trip, and fall, which then could put us underneath of this material as well. Then we get individuals that want to stand directly behind. And again, we could be within that fall zone. So really important for us to discuss that with our staff. Hopefully that's part of our safe work procedure, and that we're communicating that through our training. One of the things I always talked about was standing at a 45 to a load being moved if you can, if your drop pendant will allow you that ability. Cranes tend to move north, south, east, west. They don't tend to move on 45-degree angles unless your operators are using two controls at one time. Most pendants won't allow you to do that anymore. So at a 45 to that material is a pretty safe area for you to be outside of that drop zone. This is going to allow me to face the direction of travel, be able to see who's coming into the path of travel, be able to communicate with anybody that might be in front of me if I have to use hand signals, and keep me clear of that intended path of travel or drop zone. So things to consider there. Slings. There are all kinds of different types of slings that are used in industry, and by far the most common rigging device that I would find in industry. There are different types of slings. There are wire rope slings, chain fall slings, but probably synthetic is the most common that I would come across in industry, aside from maybe chain fall bridles, but I'll talk about that a little bit. So with these, really important again for us to discuss with our staff the need to inspect these prior to each lift. The material we're dealing with in this industry very commonly has sharp edges or abrasive corners that can deteriorate the condition of the material. unless we're using things like softeners, which is really important, something that would allow us to contour around that edge, a protective, maybe Kevlar sleeve that might go over that sling to protect it. The different types of pads that are sold that can, like leather again, that might fit inside of that sling that would protect it against that material. So we don't have things like cuts, fraying occurring. There is the potential, possibly, that there could be chemical damage, although I would think maybe more so in the concrete world, where concrete, as we know, is pretty abrasive and can definitely dry things out pretty quickly, which can lead to things like broken stitching easily, degradation of the material. So we want to be able to identify, again, for our staff what this looks like. So if you've got some bad slings, keep them around. Use them as part of your training. So we can show what a cut looks like, what they might be looking for, like the internal red threads that might be exposed, so that they know what to look for, and it's not just talking to them about it. They can practically make it make sense so that they know what they're looking for when they're using these devices out on your workplace floors. With slings, there are a few more challenges around working load limits, simply because we might be using these in different manners, and there might be some math involved in this. Things like sling angles definitely can decrease the capability of a sling. There's diameter or stress being applied to these slings again. So based on those sling angles, we want our staff to be able to determine the deficiency in the ability of that sling. Definitely important as part of our training again. And again, things like using it in a basket hitch versus a choker hitch versus a vertical hitch. 90 degrees is always best if we can get it there. And that might involve things like what we see in this image, a spreader beam. So again, if we are using spreader beams, probably, again, one of those things that I've seen more commonly that's in-house manufactured. Probably more than any other device that I've come across is an in-house manufactured spreader beam. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, it's the orange component here at the top. I've very commonly seen these manufactured in-house. We want to make sure that it has some kind of capacity identification tag on it, that again, it's getting inspected. It is a lifting device. We know what its working load limit is, or safe working load is, and also what the device weighs. We need to make sure that our staff know that that device is below the hook, so it's going to take away from the ability for that hoist to do its job. Very important. And again, important for us to know where the center of gravity of any object that we are lifting is, so that we can keep this spreader beam, if that's what we're using, over the center of gravity. So ideally, the master ring up here on the spreader beam would be over the center of gravity of that object, and that our slings are as close to 90 degrees as we can get them if that's what we're doing here. Again, making sure that we've got the right type of sling for this job. And these are very common slings in the image that I've seen here. I've seen them in the glass industry. I've seen them in the stone slab industry. Probably, again, not as much in the concrete world or metal world either. We want to check our hardware if we're using any hardware for rigging. Shackles are probably, again, one of those devices that get used incorrectly. We want to make sure we're following manufacturer's recommendations, again, keeping that part of our safe work practice. Shouldered eye bolts, very commonly incorrectly used, so definitely keep an inventory of those. They get used in the wrong plane and they get bent over very commonly. Also frequently in-house manufactured as well. So doing an inventory of those, make sure that they're in good condition. Something that might be better would be something called a swivel engineered hoist ring. If you've never heard of them, might be a good thing to Google. Swivel engineered hoist rings. They have the ability to rotate 360 degrees, 180 degrees over, as long as they're torqued to the torque spec by the manufacturer. If you have the ability to torque something in, that is. Definitely a much better device to use than a shouldered eye bolt. Another common device that I've come across out in this particular type of industry is something called a clutch ring. Clutch rings, there's many different forms of them, so this is just an example of one that I've got on the screen here. But these devices, similar to things like shackles, shouldered eye bolts. They again have that ability to swivel, connect to, usually in this industry we would see these being connected to something like a chain fall bridle. So with these we're looking for, again, distortion is probably the more common thing, where they've been bent, where they've been twisted as a result of the nature of use. They may potentially have cracks in the material. All things that we want to, again, pay attention to, train our staff on, refer to the manufacturer's instructions for that particular device about, so that we can communicate what to look for to our staff. These also connect to a pin, usually a recessed pin in a concrete preform, if you will. So we would need to look at making sure that the concrete is properly cured, that this pin is accessible, and that this is the right clutch ring for that particular pin or recessed hole that this might fit in, socket, if you will. The device fits into the socket, it connects to the pin. Usually this particular one, you rotate it 360 degrees or 180 degrees, it locks. Some of them actually have a locking mechanism. And what we're looking for is that it'll have the ability to rotate freely without rubbing or binding on the concrete itself. Really important that, again, we've got the right type, size, and you can see here on this particular unit, embossed on the unit, which is fairly common, there will be some kind of working load limit or capacity. So this one references 3 tons. They may have simply just WLL or SWL 3T on it. Again, uppercase, lowercase t, be aware of that and make sure it's correctly communicated to your staff. So with these, big thing to also pay attention to is the angle. We want to make sure that we're using the correct bridle hitch, usually, again, is what we'd be using for this, especially in the concrete world. Chain fall bridle hitches are a very common device to be used to connect to these. Chain, we want to make sure is the right grade of chain, so something to, again, consider when we're back at our workplaces. Grade 80 alloy chain, grade 100 chain is very common that we would see on the tag for the bridle hitch. Looking at the, again, working load limit for that bridle hitch, the angle that is acceptable for that hitch, all very important things for us to be looking at. So that we can keep the sling angle ideally as high as possible. And by high as possible, I mean as steep as possible. We don't want low angles. Low angles put a lot of stress on those devices, potentially spread the master ring open, and could lead to potential loss of the load or damage to the clutch ring itself, potentially even pulling it out of the material. So when we're using these, we're going to stick them in. We're going to, again, make sure that they are positively connected to the pin. We're going to ensure that our locking mechanism, if applicable, is properly engaged. Ring, again, should freely rotate without it binding at all on the concrete or against the hole. We want to keep the load angles within the manufacturer's recommendations. Again, refer to those recommendations. And avoid side loading these. It's very important. So by side loading this, we might be flipping materials over. This might not be the right device for that. And the other thing I might mention with these also, because it is that time of the year, if we're moving precast that might be used outside, check to make sure, or train your staff, have a safe working procedure around how they should potentially dislodge this from the surface that it's currently sitting on. I've seen a lot of shock loading occur, and if you're not sure of shock loading, it's more where we've kind of jerked or put an immense amount of pressure potentially on one of these lifting devices as a result of us trying to pull or pry something off of the floor because, or the ground more likely, because it's frozen into the ground. We might need things like a payloader or a front end loader or a large forklift to come and maybe initially get this loose off the ground for us first, so that we can put it on dunnage, bunks, material, so that we can then safely rig it, lift it up, and move it on to whatever truck it might be. Again, making sure that we've taken the time to pre-plan our path of travel, communicate to everybody, and keep them free and clear of the area in which we might be moving this material. Another device, and I believe this will be our last device that we'll discuss here, just again, because there are so many of them out there, would be something called a vacuum lifter. And I talk about this one because I've seen it many, many times within workplaces as well, where they have been either misused, damaged because of the way that the end user is using them. So it's really important for us to do a pre-operational inspection of any kind of vacuum lifter that we might be using in our workplace. And there's a couple of key things that we want to be looking at here. First, hoses. Again, we want to look for any kind of leakage that might be occurring. Look at the pads on the vacuum lifter. We want to make sure that they're in good condition, that they don't have any holes in them where air could escape, that they're still fairly flexible. They can become rigid over a period of time, dry cracked. We want to make sure that the vacuum hole inside of that vacuum pad is free of debris, stone dust, and any other kind of material that might get in there and get embedded, which may prevent a good seal. We want to look at the gauges on a device like this to make sure that those gauges are clear to the operator, train them on what they should be looking at. So usually we would have like a red where it's a poor seal, yellow seal, you've sealed it, but be cautious, probably still not safe to lift, and then a green seal, which indicate, or a green indicator on the gauge, which tells us we've got a good seal. It's safe for us to lift that load, move it safely. Again, very important with these devices, know your working load limit, know the capacity of the device. Make sure that we're taking the time to clean. So pre-lift, again, after each lift, clean the surface area of the pad off, clean the surface area of whatever it is that we're lifting. Any kind of dust, particulate that gets in there is going to decrease the good seal that our operators would get and increases the potential for a dropped load using these devices. We definitely don't want that to occur. And then with these devices also, they do have the ability very often to rotate, so making sure that our staff know how those devices function and how to lock them in an upright position before we obviously travel with them. We need to again remind them that this device is below the hook and that the capacity of the device takes away from the hoist capacity. It's not uncommon for these to be used on a smaller size hoist where we're maybe affecting the capacity largely. And also extremely important as part of our safe workload limit with these for us to identify the slab or material center of gravity. We need to make sure that we keep the material balanced with this. It's a vacuum seal. So if that material happens to be dusty, dirty, wet, and we haven't got the center of gravity up, there's just so many variables against us at that point where that load could start to slip and fall off as a result of what we're doing. So keeping that surface very clean is important. Making sure that the cleaned vacuum ports are maintained after each lift is extremely important as well, and should be part again of our safe work procedures around using these devices and ensuring that our staff are well trained on that. Again, a very good practice with these devices would be to perform that test lift, similar to what we talked about with our slings or our clamp. Lift the load up an inch off the surface, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. Have a look at that gauge. Make sure it's still got a good seal, that the load looks nice and balanced, and that we're ready to safely move it from point A to point B. And again, really important not to shock load any kind of load that might be attached to this type of device within our workplace. Okay, so let's talk now about how you can be prepared should, again, you get that knock on the door. Hi, I'm here from the MLITSD, and I'd like to speak to you about, in this case, maybe rigging and hoisting specifically. So first and foremost, a really good thing to do is be cordial. Allow these individuals into your workplace. Is a really good place for us to start to build that relationship with our MLITSD inspectors in our area. They're definitely going to help us keep a good, safe workplace within our good, safe workplace, simply. Common, again, at least in my experience, and Kevin can confirm this, but it's very common that we're going to have an MLITSD inspector want to speak to potentially a worker representative or a Joint Health and Safety Committee worker representative, possibly a certified member. You can see Kevin shaking his head there, so thank you for that. And if there isn't a representative available for some purpose, then they will likely speak to a number of the workers to kind of get a lay of the land and what's going on within the workplace, would be the expectation there. So where we might go to be prepared for this visit. So again, for those of you out there that may be in the health and safety world, this is probably not new to you. For those that might be part of a senior leadership and getting yourself prepared for this, or even workers, what we might expect, a good place for us to start is with that risk assessment. Really taking the time to go out, become familiar with the cranes, the hoists, the potential forklift rigging applications that we might have within our workplaces. Become familiar with the rigging operations. What are we actually rigging? What are we lifting with our cranes? What are the hazards associated with that? Have we identified all of the potential hazards, and do we have controls in place to deal with those hazards? It's not uncommon for us to identify gaps when we do this. We start out with a really good plan, we get working, we get doing the work. We obviously concern ourselves with getting product out to our clients and doing so in a timely manner. And sometimes these gaps don't get identified because of all of those other things that are going on. We need to make sure that we're taking that time to identify where gaps could potentially be in our operations. They're there, and it could be because of the nature of the work that we're doing has changed. Maybe we've got new product in our workplaces, and we really didn't think about how we were moving it at the end of the day, just that we knew our staff were good at doing this and they would somehow figure it out. So a good place to start is get out on the shop floor, take the time to do a risk assessment right from beginning. How do you plan on lifting this? Where do you plan on taking it? Common routes of travel. Identify the hazards within that common path of travel that we might be using. Methods of communication are extremely important. Again, are we training all of our staff on hand signals? Are we using communication devices? Are our staff taking the time to prep the deposit location? That was one of the key things I focused on when I was doing training, when I was doing crane training and rigging training, was really getting our staff ready to do the lift prior to doing the lift. Take the time to identify that path of travel, deposit location. Are they getting the dunnage, the bunks, the pallets, the truck bed, the people ready for us to move that material through that area? And then what to do if something doesn't go according to plan. What do we do in that case? Are we stopping? Are we doing, again, maybe a little bit more time around a risk assessment to determine, okay, if we're going to do this and things aren't working the way we wanted them to do, how do we keep people out of the area so that they aren't injured? And what are some backups that we might be able to do? So taking the time to look at that and really develop those safe work practices would be the next aspect of that. Take the information that you learned from that risk assessment and now put it into a written document that we can put down pen to paper or printer to paper, if you will, once you take the time to develop these. Really looking at the crane safe work practices from the manufacturer, the rigging safe work practices from all of those different rigging devices that we may have within our workplace, and make sure that our practices ideally align with what the manufacturer says we should be doing with those devices. That is a good question for, I think, Kevin. What ministry orders are commonly issued for these types of operations? Do you have a comment on that, Kevin?
Sorry, I'm working on 5 things and listing.
So the question was, what ministry orders are commonly issued for these types of operations? So around rigging and hoisting, potentially, what kind of orders might an end client see?
So, I mean, depending on what we find, so for example, training, it could be 25-2A. For maintaining equipment, if we notice that it's, a bit frayed or not into a good condition, 25-1B we could issue. You covered 3 of them, 3 of the big ones here. Obviously, it's the one that's not on there. Potentially, it could be the 25-2H, right? The reasonable precaution thing.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. I would say generally, most of what we'd be looking at would be the training, the procedural development that's associated with that training, and then the equipment itself. Is it being maintained and used properly? Those are probably the big 3 orders that will come from this.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Well, hopefully that answers the question there. So that said, again, once we take the time to go through and develop these safe work practices, again, and that's where I referenced 25-2A in this, is now it's time for us to communicate those safe work practices. Really important that there is some kind of formalized training to go along with those. And I'll speak more about that in a minute. We want to make sure that we are taking the time to do a rigging equipment inventory and make sure that there's proper maintenance occurring. Our well-educated MLI TSD inspectors going out into your workplace are going to notice when there might be things like in-house manufactured lifting devices. So it's better that we go and catch those as part of our, maybe again, risk assessment in our workplace and become familiar with them existing in the workplace, and then start to look to see, do we have proper documentation around those devices? Like I said, it's not uncommon for me to see them in workplaces. I've come across many workplaces where they've had to, because of the nature of the work that's being performed, develop a rigging device, but it's been done in accordance with good engineering practice. We've got engineers involved, someone that is qualified has signed off on that device being used in the workplace, provided us with a safe working load, or a working load limit, a capacity, if you will, and documentation for that. So for us in the senior leadership team, or our leadership team, we want to make sure that we've got that documentation, that we can prove that the devices that we have in our workplaces are safe for our staff to be using, and that we again have safe work procedures around those devices being used within the workplace. So again, when we look to that inspection readiness, make sure that you've got those properly developed hoisting, rigging practices, and as I said earlier, make sure you've got a good training program in place. As Kevin said, this is going to be something that they are going to be looking at. We look for it also from WSPS when we're doing work with you as well, so that's where I tend to go. But we want to see that you've got good safe work practices that then can be communicated out to your staff, and the best way to do that is for competent training to occur, making sure that you've got qualified individuals that are making sure that both theoretical training, maybe a theoretical test might be a good idea to prove knowledge, and then a practical assessment or practical training prior to an assessment is really good also. Have them practice lifting the different loads that they might be lifting within the workplace. Have them practice rigging those loads up with the supervision of a competent person, so that that person can correct any errors or mistakes that potentially occurred during that rigging, and be able to explain to them why what they were doing was unsafe, and how to identify how to use it properly, and making sure that it's connected in the way that the manufacturer intended, or that your company wants, based on, again, safe work practice. So really important, make sure we've got competent people doing that. And then once we've got these practices in place, really important also to make sure that we've got competent supervision. One of the things that we used to do at my previous work was, as a trainer, we would invite supervisors into that training at no charge to the organization, because we wanted those supervisors to understand what kind of training their staff were being provided, that they had the knowledge, the training, awareness of potential hazards around the use of these devices, because we might have really good supervisors in our workplace on how to get material through the production floor, but are they aware of the hazards related to the tasks, the peripheral tasks in some places we see them called, like lifting and moving materials that aren't a part of overall production in some cases. So we want to make sure that those individuals are competent to recognize these hazards, recognize safe work practices, how rigging equipment should be used, how cranes should be used, methods around communication to relate those hazards to the staff that might be exposed in the area in which rigging and hoisting is occurring. It's not always the operator or the rigger that might be exposed to those hazards. It could be those bystanders around it as well that aren't aware because they just don't know. So having those supervisors available that are competent, that can communicate that and make sure that people are out of the areas where these potential risks exist, is that much better for us. So again, make sure that our supervisors have the training, have the knowledge, have the experience, awareness of the hazards that could be around when rigging and hoisting, and that they know the act and the regulations around, again, rigging and hoisting, and that they're enforcing them. So we've got 19 minutes left. I'm gonna ask, maybe, and I might be catching Connie off guard here. I don't know if we can give Connie access to her mic or not, but I invited Lori to come on last week and speak to some of the things that we could potentially do to assist some of our clients here around this. So Connie, I don't know if you're willing to, but I'm going to allow your mic there, and if you want to come off of mute and maybe just speak to some of the things that we can do on site to support our clients. Maybe Connie's not. There you are.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Oh,
Welcome.
wonderful. Okay, excellent. So we have what's called free health and safety assessments for Ontario workplaces. And I can put the link to our webpage on that on the chat in a moment. But things like we can come on site and do a workplace safety checkup. And it's really a high level, you know, are you in compliance with the Act and the regulations? We also have a material handling assessment. This is specific to looking at lift trucks, pedestrian safety, lockout, tagout, and looking at, again, manual material handling. How are people loading, unloading trailers, that kind of thing. We also have what's called a workplace chemical walkthrough. Well, this one here is, as the name implies, very specific, looking at your WHMIS, you know, and chemical safety program, and taking a look at, you know, what controls you currently have in place, and maybe identifying any opportunities for improvement. We also have an ergonomic, I can't even say the word. Ergonomic, thank you, Clinton. Ergonomic walkthrough, which is specific to retail operations, retail stores. So we want to take a look at that and do a bit of a observation around what risks there may be and how we can and what we suggest for helping to hopefully eliminate them, but certainly help to prevent injury. So again, I could go on, but I will put the link on the chat. And if you are interested in any of these, please send me an email, and I'll get you connected to your account manager to arrange the service. So I'll put that in the chat as well. Hopefully
Perfect.
That's good enough. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you,
Thank
Connie.
you.
Appreciate it. So where we are, folks, is at the question area. We've got about 16 minutes to ask questions. The floor is open here, and I think what we'll do is, if you wouldn't mind stopping the recording at this point, Jim, just because, again, there might be questions that people don't want as a part of a recording. So if you don't mind doing that, that would be appreciated.